of Birds at the Raptor Center here in Minnesota. I work with our education team, and our education team includes about 30 non-releasable education ambassador raptors. And so I just want to make a quick plug for our digital programs. We've been working hard on some digital programs. So if you have been on way too many Zoom or WebEx or Meet or whatever format calls, then consider inviting a raptor to one of your online meetings. We've been doing something called Raptor Zoomies, which has been super fun. Did one for a group of architects last week, which made me think to share that with you. But a great way to liven up a meeting or a family gathering or anything like that. So my current role is working with raptors like this, many different kinds of raptors, but I'm here because this issue of birds in windows was really my primary focus for quite a while. I started a program here in Minnesota to study the problem and to address solutions. Led a 10-year research study, which I'll talk a little bit about, just the pertinent findings from that are pertinent to you. And I worked with municipalities and architects and planners and collaborators really all over the world to promote solutions. And part of that was the development of this course. So the course is actually made possible by the American Bird Conservancy. So they manage all the details with AIA and GBC, so you can get credit. We also really appreciate your feedback. Help us get smarter by filling out a course evaluation, if you don't mind, afterwards. So yes, there's a lot to cover. We have about 4 key learning objectives. We'll start with the groundwork, kind of understanding buildings and birds and how they interact. Spend most of our time talking about current best practices in preventing collisions, and then how to integrate architecture with other aspects of green design. Very little time just briefly on reviewing the state of legislation, major moving target right now, which is actually a great thing. And then finally, just a few ways that you can access existing resources after we leave each other today. So first, birds. Besides the simple miracle that birds exist in the infinite variety, birds matter, and when they do well, so do we. Birds are insect predators, they're seed dispersers, they're pollinators, they are hunters and hunted. They are key indicators of the quality and health of our environment. They're super fun to watch as part of a $41 billion industry, which is bird watching. And they are protected. For the most part, birds are protected by state and local laws. So they're an important part of our world, our heritage, and really our society. And birds are accessible. They're often people's best connection with nature. Just about anywhere you go, any time of year, you have a good chance of seeing some kind, if not many kinds of birds. And they are absolutely everywhere. So this is a NextRad image of the US. This is technology that's usually used for weather forecasting. We also can use this type of network, this radar network, to watch and track the movements of birds. And that's what tells us that birds are everywhere. The blue circles reflect the density of flocks of birds that are migrating over a radar station. And so while it looks like they're sort of blobs, that's just because that's what is picked up on radar. But you can picture the entire, really half of the United States in this particular day covered with migrating birds at night. And so they are truly everywhere, which means this issue of bird window collisions really applies to all of us, no matter where we live. So first, understanding how buildings affect birds. Buildings really affect birds in 3 major ways. One is through habitat destruction and fragmentation, which is really the biggest problem facing all birds, safe to say, everywhere. Building and development, of course, has a role to play in that. Climate change is also a serious problem. Buildings are a factor in climate change because of the amount of energy they use and the amount of CO2 they produce. And of course, birds crash into buildings, which is why we're here together talking about this issue. And of course, that's what we'll focus on. So the problem of bird window collisions is familiar to most of us. It's a form of what we call direct mortality versus habitat destruction and climate change, which are more sort of quiet and private in a way, if you will. Birds are harmed by those two things because they lose resources and the ability to breed and survive. But window collisions are direct, meaning that we can see them, we can count them, and in many cases we know exactly when they happened and how. So direct mortality. And the problem is big. Window collisions are the largest form of collision mortality. That is, birds crash into a lot of different things, but of all the things they crash into, windows kill the most. About between the median range is about 600 million birds a year in the United States alone. So the problem is big and it's depressing, but right up front, I always like to remind people that this is a preventable problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit through some of the science. The science can get to be complex, especially with scientists who love to look at every angle on these things. We are dealing with a living organism, many living organisms, hundreds of species ranging over thousands of miles in their own free will and responding to a range of environmental and human factors that we probably don't really appreciate. So it can be complex, and we can divide it in many different ways and study it in many different ways, but the solutions really don't have to be all that complex. So again, I'm going to show this to you up front, and we're going to visit this slide again, and we're going to talk about each of these things. But really, we're talking about a few basic things. We need to make bird safety a consideration from the beginning of a project, just integral to what the project is. And then we focus on a few aspects of glass: how much glass, where the glass is, and like what specific kind of glass is spec'd. And then we want to look at light pollution, reducing light pollution. And then as a kind of to wrap it all together, look at leveraging the ways that bird safety can be accomplished as a bonus kind of to the other goals that we're already interested in designing buildings in terms of beauty, aesthetics, energy performance, all those kinds of things. So keep that in mind. It's a preventable problem. It can be complex, but we can try to make it much simpler. And we'll look at all of these things in turn. And another word of reassurance right off the top: we're not talking about a choice between making buildings like this and making buildings like this. A lot of people might think we're talking about concrete boxes, and no, not at all. Solutions, especially when they're integral to the project from the beginning, are so many and varied and beautiful. So we'll show you some cool examples, and there's even so many more. And if you want to build an all-glass bird-safe building, you can. This is the Javits Center, a conference center, convention center in New York City. This had the distinction of being the worst building for bird collisions in all of New York City. And it went through a complete reglazing about a decade ago. I think it was completed in like 2014 or something. And they replaced, I think, virtually all the glass, most of the glass. They kept a very similar look. They improved efficiency. They kept the great views out of the building, and they reduced collisions to nearly zero. So that is an all-glass building that is bird safe. And with that backdrop, I have to just mention off the top, the stadium here in Minneapolis, people had been working on bird window collisions for decades, like all over the world, and we had been working on them locally here for about 8 years when this design was unveiled. And our state standard, which again I'll talk about later, the Minnesota Sustainable Building Guidelines, which included a portion on bird safety, had literally just gone into effect when the design rendition came out. I had been speaking to architects and glass manufacturers and consulting on project for years, but nothing brought the issue into the public conscience like this building did. So once the rendition came out, we connected immediately. I led discussions with the team and with the building owners about solutions and possibilities for modifying their design. We gave them specs, like for example, from the Javits, all kinds of things. It wasn't one discussion, it was many in-depth collaborative meetings over the course of a year or more. And so many years ago now, it's hard to stress or really even remember how much went into that effort to change the design. And so many times it seemed like it was a sure thing. But unfortunately, as most people that live here at least know, that in the end, it didn't happen. The stadium was built as spec'd, and it blew up in the media worldwide. And as we predicted, not really to the benefit of the team or of the building. So a lot of people have fought really hard, including Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis has been in the center of it. It was a huge opportunity lost, but we move on, we learn, and we still are holding out hope for some kind of a retrofit. And I think it has certainly led to a much greater understanding of the issue in much more circles, and it has led to more solutions. So that's sort of like locally a big thing we think about when we think about collisions. So why was that building such a concern, like from the very minute the rendition, showed up on our front page of the Star Tribune, I think it was. It brings us to why collisions happen. So we just get on the same page about this. The problem is really twofold. It's about certain aspects of glass, so reflection and transparency, and it's also about light pollution. Light pollution is a problem for all living creatures, including humans, and it's a problem that I think has, for the most part, really gotten away from us. So this image and this video, which I will play, it won't have sound. This video shows birds attracted into the powerful light beams at the 9/11 Memorial and Lights in New York City. And each dot is a small songbird. So many of them migrate at night. And these particular birds have been attracted to the powerful light beams that are used to memorialize the Twin Towers every September. So they're flying circles literally within the beams as if they're physically trapped within the light. And in this case, fortunately, lights can be, and with a concerted effort by a lot of people, they are shut down so that birds can move on. So periodically throughout the night, they shut down the lights, the birds move on. But unfortunately, all over the world, light pollution is harming human health and wildlife, and it attracts birds in and around buildings where they face a lot of different hardships. So we'll talk about some best practices around lighting, and just can't forget about that issue. So we'll circle back to that a bit later. But in terms of reflection, most birds are colliding during the daytime because of these confusing aspects of glass. So birds see this super realistic looking habitat or sky sometimes reflected in glass, and they really have no reason to not believe that what they see is what they would get. And in fact, we see the same thing, and without context cues, without really a broader understanding, we would also not be able to tell the difference between what is real and what is not for reflection. So humans use these context cues without even really being aware of it. We understand glass, and we can read the tiniest things even subconsciously to tell us that it's not glass or not real. So the other side of the glass sort of coin is transparency. So birds see through one pane or more panes of glass, transparent glass, and they see attractants that they want to get to on the other side. So again, habitat or sky. And this is one of really the worst cases I think I've ever seen personally. It's a 250-foot long glass walkway, and it happens to be right on the bluff of the Mississippi. But just what I've happened to see, I'm sure there are things like this existing unfortunately, many places. And then sometimes for us, like here in cold climates where we have skyways, you get this sometimes both reflection and transparency in the same confusing elevated glass walkway, in this case, that goes right through treetops. So that's reflection and transparency. And again, coming back to this, even people think they see glass, but by design, they do not. Glass is clear and people crash into glass all the time. I pulled this headline and article from, it's actually from The Guardian, talking about Apple's multi-billion-dollar headquarters in California and how people were crashing into the clear glass there, to the point where they had a number of injuries, and actually people had to go to the hospital. So it's not that birds are dumb, it's that glass is clear. And I'm going to put these people out of their misery and move on. Okay, so people, again, coming back to this idea that we understand glass when we're given just a small amount of context. Birds need more. Birds need more cues to tell them that there's a barrier there. They're tiny, they're maneuverable, they're used to and designed for zipping through small spaces. So these huge gaps above and below that tiny line are perfectly plenty of space for a bird to zip through, and that's why they do that. And we'll talk more about that also in a little bit. So a little bit on what the science says. Project Bird Safe is the project I led here. We had a 10-year research project, so I'm just going to pull a couple of little tidbits from that that help inform how we think about collisions and kind of the body of knowledge. So this, details are not super important, but this is a kind of an important conceptually, that bird collisions don't happen equally throughout the year. So that's applicable because very often I'd get contacted by people that were in a panic because it was September or October and they're having tons of birds hitting their building. So we'd have conversations, we'd share information, they'd make big plans, but then things would sort of settle down and other priorities would take over. Then spring would happen, saw a little bit, not huge. But then here again, fall would happen and the same thing would repeat itself. And that's because while collisions do happen all year round, the birds most frequently killed are migratory birds that collide when they're traveling through on their spring and fall migration between breeding and wintering grounds. And so I always like to say to people that make sure that you try to, I don't know if you can see my cursor, you handle your problem in here sometimes when the weather allows mitigation on window surfaces and before you hit the fall migration, because once you hit fall, you're right in the midst of it and it can be hard to implement solutions. So it's cyclical based on bird movements, and most of the collisions we see here in the Twin Cities are on the migration. Another thing to realize is that year to year is quite different as well. And so one year you could have a problem and the next year it's less, but again, it's on the same premise that it's, if you have a problem, fix it because it will probably come back again. And in terms of species, we found about 135 different species of birds in the Twin Cities total. Birds across the board are affected by this problem. Hundreds of different species have been documented, and consistent with other studies, the birds we found, the vast majority were native, long distance migrants, mostly migrating at night. And that is pretty consistent. Generally not finding common birds that we associate with city life, birds like pigeons, starlings, and English sparrows, which are all, by the way, not actually native species. So often people ask me, if this is such a big problem, why don't we see more? And that's a really good question, and there's a lot of answers for that. So the thing to realize is that most of these birds are very, very small. They fall in places where they're unseen or camouflaged, or quite frankly, just not apparent to most people because most people just aren't really in tune to looking for them. So this is a type of bird called a Nashville warbler, one of the most frequent birds that we found over the 10 years of our study, and they literally weigh 1/3 of 1 ounce. And as a side, they migrate between Mexico and Canada twice a year, every year. So that's goes in that amazing category. But they're really small and hard to see. And quite honestly, there's more reasons not to see them than to see them. So birds fall into places where they're unable to be even accessed. They're picked up by scavengers, they're cleaned up by maintenance, and still, and sometimes when it's really bad, even average people who aren't usually in tune to that will see them, because if you get 10 or 12 birds at a single facade, it starts to get obvious to most people. So out of that and into this, what can be done? This is the reason we're together, to learn about this. What is bird-friendly design? So it's not really any one thing, not one product or one technique or any one-size-fits-all solution. So it's really bigger than that, and it's emerging and excitingly moving all the time, kind of like never before. So I said I'd been interested in this issue for probably 14 or 15 years. And at no time have things been moving as quickly as they're moving now. So it's a really exciting time. And we bring this issue to you, as many, I hope, are design professionals. We can tell you what's known from a bird perspective, but really solutions lie with the expertise and vision and creativity of designers and architects who are built for solving problems. So we're going to jump into the thick of it, which is the best practices for preventing collisions and integrating bird-friendly design with other aspects of green and sustainable design. So again, this one, we're going to look at strategies in these kind of 4 different areas, and thinking of bird safety, again, not as an add-on, an added element, but as completely integral to the design, allows for so many creative options. If it's an add-on or an afterthought, or it gets cut and you have to fix it later, you can, but your options are much more limited and also expensive and also temporary. If you fix something later, sometimes you're going to have to refix it again. So that's just can't be stressed enough. So whereas the problem is about glass and lighting, so are the solutions. It's about reducing glass hazards and reducing light pollution. You can kind of think of it as an equation. If we have attractants and we have hazards, we put birds at risk. We want to flip that equation. We want to, with every project, every development, we want to protect and increase and incorporate habitat, because we need habitat everywhere and anywhere possible. We want to add in these bird-friendly best practices, and those 2 things together will actually improve the ability of our building sites to support and protect birds and their habitats. So I'm going to talk about best practices in kind of those 4 areas related to glass and to lighting, about minimizing glass area. So knowing that birds are everywhere and so are buildings, it's important to know that one of the strongest predictors of risk to birds is glass area. So studies have shown that for every 10% increase in glass area, there's a 20 to 30% increase in fatalities. So the more glass is on a facade, absolutely or proportionally, the more collisions you're going to have. And really, I think more and more people are wondering about the role of these enormous curtain walls and the role they play in this whole question of sustainable design when they become really expensive to heat and cool. So best practice number 1 is to minimize or reduce glass area. Another key thing to understand is the role of habitat around buildings in increasing risk. So in science, we call this a sink. It's attracting birds to a place, birds or any animals, to a hazard or a detrimental situation of some kind where they then face a hazard. Habitat adjacency is consistently correlated with collision risk, and that's really bad news, because birds desperately need habitat like this anywhere and everywhere possible. I'll say that many times. And the solution isn't to get rid of the habitat. The solution is to make the glass safe. So think of that sort of as a paradigm. As I talk through these various risk factors, it's important to know about the risk factors and helpful, but the most important thing to do is to deal with the glass. So if you treat the glass, many of the other factors I'm going to talk about really become somewhat irrelevant. You can have as much habitat as you want if you protect the glass. So that's a key. And take green roofs, for example. More and more studies show that green roofs can actually provide real food and shelter and even nesting sites for birds. But they also can bring birds into contact with glass that they might not encounter otherwise. This is a green roof in Chicago, and it's at the building of the architecture firm called Studio Gang. And Jeannie Gang, who founded that firm, was actually an early leader in bird-friendly architecture. So of course she did not build a dangerous green roof. They, of course, created a custom frit pattern for the glass that's adjacent to that green roof. And they also have been monitoring it, but on the, kind of in the bigger picture, that firm, Studio Gang, and many others now are looking at green roofs as really productive, important native habitats that can create useful habitat corridors for birds, even in some of our busiest cities like Chicago. So that's good news. So green roofs, great, and protect any glass adjacent to a green roof. Conceptually, when you look at a whole building, we think of the ground level stories, first 2 to 3 stories, 1 to 3 stories, as the most hazardous to birds. So that's why most legislation stipulates mitigating glass up to a certain height. That makes sense statistically because the ground levels where you've got a lot of things coming together, you tend to have a lot of glass. Birds are using these areas because there tends to be habitat in those areas with plantings of all different kinds. You also have a lot of both reflective and see-through situations happening in those first stories. That's why statistically they're the most hazardous and the place where we benefit to put a lot of our attention. Also, you tend to have more glass there in general on those facades, tends to be clear and see-through. And you also can have indoor attractants. So these are trees literally inside buildings. And when the outside is very sparse, then birds, I've watched birds try to get to trees like this. Another way of reducing exposure, kind of in this whole category of understanding how different features affect birds, is to look at clear barriers. So more and more, there's all different kinds of glass structures being built in places where they just shouldn't be and where they are a serious threat to birds. These are just a few examples of like wind walls, glass railings, noise barriers, transit shelters, all kinds of structures that are glass and unmitigated. So if there was just one thing I could outlaw, it would be this kind of a hazard. Glass just out in the world where it can harm birds. Little side story about that. This is an example of a clear barrier that was installed at the University of Minnesota. It was during the process of a renovation of this upper plaza, and these railings are all perfectly clear. And what happened was birds would fly in over the top and they would take the shortest distance right over this edge and hit the glass railings. And within just a few days of this plaza opening, birds were hitting the glass railings in very large numbers. I think it was like 40 birds in a 3-hour period hit on one certain day. And thankfully, the facilities management responded. I always say that this was the ugliest and the most beautiful thing I've ever seen at the same time. To their credit, this was their emergency response, which stopped the problem right away and gave us time to do this. So we mobilized a team and we created a medium-term solution using translucent tape that was then being sold by ABC. ABC is still working on who is going to be selling that tape, but this is still how it looks today. So that was an immediate response that has turned into multi-years now, almost 10 years, 10 years it's been in place now. Okay, so another way of reducing exposure of glass where birds are using it is to know about something we call channeling. Birds tend to follow open pathways through environments of all kinds, and paths made by humans for humans often end at glass doors, for example. So it's something to know. Think about your site and how birds might be using it. And light pollution, again, it's this problem that's just gotten pervasive. We forget that we as humans need natural rhythms of light and dark for our basic physical health, and artificial light at night is detrimental to our health. And still it seems to be in every new project, every new home, every street improvement or building comes with its own like personal lighting package, regardless of what light already exists, or sometimes the actual need. So really being super attentive to what light is being added to a project, and some of the best practices we will talk through. Really, the light pollution in the built environment has increased dramatically. It used to be that you'd hear stories of these huge kill-offs of birds at the few tall, bright buildings, but it really isn't that way anymore, because any individual bright building is really embedded in this whole sea of light. And Houston is just an example that I had, but there's probably images like this of many cities. So again, it's a problem that we just can't forget to address, and it does obviously affect birds in a major way. Okay, so what stops collisions? What stops collisions is some kind of pattern that creates a visual cue for them to say, don't go here. And research has shown that small birds will attempt to fly through very small spaces. They have a very accurate sense of their body shape and size. They know exactly where they are in space, and they will, especially the super acrobatic ones like this barn swallow, they're a major exception. They are an incredibly dynamic flyer, but they will attempt to fly through very tiny spaces because they know what their body fits through. And that leads us to a rule that you will hear about if you haven't already. We call it the 2x4 rule, basically meaning that you kind of, as a rule, have got to try to close down spaces to where they're small enough where birds don't think they can fly through them. And I will show you visual examples that will help you understand what I'm talking about there. And back to this, people can see glass if we have a few well-spaced cues to tell them it's there. Birds just need more cues. So we need to incorporate more what we call visual cues, visual signals, or you'll hear them called markers in glass, to signal for birds not to fly there. And the 2x4 rule gives us sort of this basic vertical and horizontal spacing, but not everything has to be lines or dots in these patterns. It's just giving us the basics to work from. So that is, if you used a line pattern or similar, this is how you'd want the spacing to be. Testing shows that 2 inches on the horizontal and 4 inches on the vertical is what tends to stop birds from going to a space. And then the pattern elements, so like the lines or the dots or whatever, have to be a certain size and visibility too. It all comes down to like how whatever it is you're proposing physically looks in real life. The markers have to be visible to birds in order to stop them. And you'll also hear people talking about 2x2. Birds like hummingbirds are adept at flying through even smaller spaces. 2x4, 2x2, you'll hear both. Okay, let me talk a little bit about tunnel tests and threat factors, which are things you've probably heard about. So tunnel testing is a testing methodology that helps us determine what markings or signals or cues birds best perceive. And tunnel testing has been used to create threat factors for specific materials. And I'll tell you how it works. Okay, so basically you go to a place where you can catch a lot of birds. This one is at research station in Pennsylvania. This is a gentle way of catching birds called mist netting. Mist netting has been used for hundreds of years to catch birds, tag them, and release them. So birds are gently caught in mist nets, taken out carefully. They are measured, and all the scientific information that was the reason for catching them happens. Those things happen, and then the birds, before they're released, they just do one little more thing for us. They are taken and they are sent down this tunnel. And what happens is, here's the hole that she is looking at. She's holding a little tiny, looks like a Canada warbler. And at the far end of the tunnel, is a big pane of glass with, I should say, very emphatically, a net in front of it. So the bird's not going to be harmed. The bird there faces two different choices. It faces a control and it faces a test. In this case, the test is the striped pattern. The control is the clear. In, say, for example, 100 flights, if 80 times the bird flies to the control and only 20 times they fly to the test panel, that's showing they're making a choice. That's more than random, 50-50. They're making a choice, and that glass would get a threat factor of 20. So that's how threat factors come about. Lower numbers are better. So if anybody has questions about that, we can talk about that after, but that's how we get to threat factors, which are pertinent for a lot of legislation and things like that. Okay, so I want to get to examples because that's all sort of the background. I want to look at examples in all of these different areas and talk about, in real life, how do we act? What do these buildings actually look like? And so in reality, there's countless bird-safe buildings existing. Many of them were created inadvertently to take advantage of some product or innovation that was available for an aesthetic reason or any number of reasons that an architect had. And these used to be the only examples we had, but now there are so many examples of buildings that were actually built with birds in mind, not accidentally bird friendly, but intentionally bird friendly. And so those are the ones I'm going to focus on in showing you next here. So before we get into them, I'm going to tell you how I'm kind of dividing them up. So when I describe sort of the categories of solutions or fixes for people, I usually put them in these three categories. I think pretty much all of our solutions, either design side solutions or retrofit solutions, fall in these three categories. So you either have something, a visual barrier of some kind on the actual surface of the glass, or you have a visual barrier of some kind in front of the glass, or you have a physical barrier of some kind in front of the glass. So I'm going to show you examples of all those three categories. The first one is what we have the most examples of, and that's visual barriers on the surface of glass. So I'll show you like design side examples first, and then I'll show you retrofit examples. So a bunch of design side examples would include architectural frit. So architectural frit or fritted glass is a technology that was available long before people were thinking about birds and windows. It's permanent patterns, silk screened, usually onto one of the inner surfaces of a glass unit. Basically has four surfaces, one of the inner surfaces of a glass unit. And now more and more, I'm happy to say, we're seeing frit on the outer or number one surface, which is really the preferred surface for birds. And briefly why that is because of that reflection. If you have outer surface one reflection, but an inner surface pattern, sometimes in some conditions, the reflection can overwhelm the pattern, and the reflection is what we see, not the pattern. So that's why we push for surface one. And again, more and more, I'm seeing projects coming up with surface one frits. So architectural frit is readily available. It's commonly used for energy performance, energy efficiency. But the patterns which provide that shading, which is the efficiency part of it, turns out to help birds. Birds can see those fritted patterns sometimes, depending on the pattern. Now, this pattern was specifically designed by Viricon, which is a Minnesota glass manufacturer who's been real active in bird safety. And they designed a frit to adhere to that 4-inch vertical line spacing that we know works for bird safety. So I won't talk that much on each slide, but that's the background on architectural frit, or fritted glass, as you might sometimes hear it called. Many other examples. This is at the Bell Museum. They use 2 kinds of architectural frit at the Bell. And I want to mention with this one a lesson that I learned with this project, and that's the power of like the mind's eye. And so after the Bell was finished, I was consulting on a different project, which I'll show you in the next slide. And that group, the architectural group, was the Cunningham group, and they had taken this course that I'm giving you now, or some version of it, and they were kind of working through to envision some of those glass choices into their design. And I suggested that they visit the Bell and see, you know, a built example for themselves. And so while you can see the dots and stripes close up, when you actually go there, those patterns disappear from afar. And that project that the Cunningham group was working on was the Minnehaha Academy. Part of that building was destroyed in a really tragic explosion, and they were working on rebuilding that portion, and they had a lot of sustainable goals. This building sits right on the Mississippi, also in Minneapolis. So after visiting the Bell, I think they selected the exact same glass for the school. And the little fun aside, when I visited to take these pictures earlier this summer, I took this photo in the bottom of a robin who was feeding on some of the berry producing trees that they had put on the site, which is great, in front of a wall of striped fritted bird safe glass. So that is many principles in action there. Okay, another example, this is at the State University of New York at Brockport. There was an architect there named Paul Tankel who took this picture, who got really interested in bird safety. He did a number of really cool projects there on campus. This one I'm showing you has 2 different aspects. One is these upper level louvers. Louvers can create a visual barrier, not a physical barrier. A bird could still hit that, but it's an external visual barrier in front of the glass. And they also designed a custom frit, which, if you can see this lined frit pattern on the lower part, one of the cool things they did was they paid attention to, took into consideration the main view shed in this walkway. So that's about the height where people are walking. They graduated the lines out to much wider than the 2 inches. They didn't keep the 2 inches consistent, which is perfectly applicable. A great way to accommodate vision, being able to view out of the glass, and also still have a very much visual noise on that surface that would really help birds from hitting that. Another example on campus of architectural frit in use. This is a more consistent pattern, again at SUNY Brockport. Here in Minnesota, we have a number of examples. This is at the Science Museum of Minnesota. They have huge multi-story glass walls. Frit was incorporated on that. Being the Science Museum, it could have been partly for birds, but primarily for heat gain, to keep that space from getting overly hot. This is an example from Indiana, which I think is beautiful. It's kind of a skyway used as a formal gathering space, and would be very applicable to any kind of skyways, walkways, glass linkways, where you get great light still, but have a pattern on the surface. At our Children's Museum in Minneapolis, a number of frit patterns were used. This shows some of the multi-use of frits, helps save birds, which probably was not their first priority. But the lower level glass is actually over I think it's actually like a gift store area. So it's protecting merchandise from either being seen or from heat or from sun. An example of a custom frit in Brooklyn at the Botanical Gardens. And this is a different surface treatment. which is a technology that's now available from several manufacturers. And it's glass with a UV pattern incorporated into it. So birds briefly have a very different visual system than we do, including the ability of some species to see down into the ultraviolet. So the idea is this is kind of a panacea, visible to birds because it's got UV patterns on it, but invisible to us because we can't see UV. So there's some concern voiced about the fact, couple things, not all birds do see in ultraviolet. Also, ultraviolet like signals in the environment are not always really strong. If there's a lot of cloud cover or in certain parts of the world, UV is not really strong. But still, a number of manufacturers are really working hard on this technology, and it has been installed in a number of different locations. And anecdotally, it sounds like it is performing well from a bird's perspective, but good to know that that exists. And a couple other examples of it installed here at a National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. At another, this is also a refuge station in British Columbia. And then another, one of my personal favorite solutions is etched glass. And the reason I like etched glass is because when the glass is etched on the #1 surface, for those reasons I mentioned before about frit. But again, now that architectural frit is becoming more available, it also vies for my favorite if it's applied on the #1 surface. So etched glass, a number of companies produce etched glass. This is an example from Walker. They have a number of different patterns that they produce for bird safety. And I just got these images actually through the Audubon chapter of Minneapolis from the Bakken Museum here in Minneapolis, where, by the way, we were first initially supposed to do this talk in person, which would have been cool to be able to show this, but they used etched glass on this sort of glass tower situation. I'm not even sure what it is because I've never been there. And then here's a couple other examples. I'm sorry I don't know where they are, and I'm sorry I don't know who to credit them to. They're pictures I received over time, but I love this one for a couple of reasons. I like to use this one to talk about that sort of spirit of the law and the letter of the law in terms of the 2x4 rule and visual noise. So you can see that this, I personally love this design, but this glass panel does not follow the letter of the 2x4 law. There are many spaces there that are bigger than 4 inches even. But what they've done here is they've created a lot of visual noise, a lot of busyness that would probably go a long way. I can't tell you what percentage of birds it would stop, but it would probably go a long way to stopping collisions just because it's so busy and creates a lot of that visual noise that we're looking for. Another one, I don't know who sent it, but I like it because, again, it's sort of when we get situations here in Minnesota where we have multi-layer skyways, this is the kind of solution that you could use there. Okay, then in terms of visual barriers on the surface, I'm going to show you some retrofit solutions. This is a solution we did at the Raptor Center. It's a custom film that we installed on the outer surface of the lobby glass to keep birds from hitting the lobby, to fulfill our mission to protect birds and not kill them at our own building. And I think it's kind of fun and beautiful. We actually left the old falcon silhouettes up and we incorporated them into the design. So oftentimes you'll see a building with a big pane of glass and a single falcon silhouette. And first to say, it doesn't matter if it's a falcon or a butterfly. Birds don't think it's a falcon, by the way. If you have only the falcon, you've left too much of that glass exposed and birds can just go above or below because, again, they know that that's not a falcon. So we incorporated it into the design and had a whole bunch of little birds and a falcon silhouette chasing it. So that was kind of fun. Okay, another example at the University of Minnesota is a linkway between 2 buildings on the St. Paul campus. And this one is an example of a perforated film, and the magic of perforated films you've experienced if you've ridden in any kind of a wrapped bus or transit, a transit car of any kind. It's used for you know, advertising graphics, and it was used here to protect this ground level see-through hazard. And I love having the inside and outside because you wouldn't believe that there's that film on the outside. And this is literally 100% bird safe. So perforated films are super appropriate in certain places. So good to know about that. Aveda Corporation here in Minnesota, they created 2 custom films. They also couldn't use any typical on the market films because some of the ingredients, if you will, in the films didn't adhere to their supply chain restrictions. So they developed their own films and installed them in multiple places around their headquarters building, which was experiencing collisions. And this is a cool example, Southwest Transit, a transit station out in Eden Prairie in Minnesota. One of our volunteers for Project Bird Safe, when I worked there, that was traveled through here, began collecting birds. We paid them a visit, gave them some information, and pretty soon this happened without our help, except maybe a little help, and stopped that very classic hazard again that I'd like to outlaw. Okay, other examples. This is a commercial film, so a commercially available film, not a custom design, but one you can buy from a company called Solex. I don't think I'm supposed to be telling about companies, but sorry about that. That is a striped pattern, again, a film on the exterior surface. Now this is a different category of fixes for usually small scale, good for homes, but I have seen it seen strings like this installed on pretty big installations. This is at my own home. This is in a similar but different fun example, another one at the University of Minnesota by a student club called Art for Birds, where they took it upon themselves to tackle many different hazardous situations around campus in a very fun and artistic way. This is strings slightly modified, used at an eco lodge in Costa Rica and at a church in Manamidi. So those are examples of not physical barriers. They're not going to stop the birds, but they're going to stop them by being a visual barrier, telling birds to turn around and don't go here. Okay, so last category, creating a physical barrier in front of the glass. I show a house because the best example of this is external screens. In a lot of new houses, you don't see external screens, but all of the windows except the sliding glass door on the bottom of this home are external screens, and also the little tiny skylights at the top are not safe. But compared to big picture windows that most suburban houses have, just know that it is an option to put screens on homes still. You can also add screens if screens weren't installed. This is a way of adding screens over windows that didn't have them. Other things you can put over are things like solar or security shades. I took these pictures both in sort of cabin country, where sometimes people will pull down shades over their windows because of the lot of time that don't spend at the cabin. Okay, and then this is a really cool example also here in Minnesota, the Transit Center on the West Bank of the University of Minnesota. It's a public art project, and they specifically highlighted the birds of the, migrating through the Mississippi flyway. So that is an example of an external physical barrier. Birds can't physically reach the glass to hit it. It's also, of course, a visual barrier, but it's a physical barrier, and there's many, many examples of that. Okay, then I'm going to show you a couple that I call integrated solutions, because these projects used a number of different strategies. This is this really cool lead. This is a project that got the lead credit for bird safety. It's in Salt Lake City, the Tracy Aviary, and they use a number of different things. They use the UV glass I was talking about. They use some really boldly patterned spotted glass. And they also use this really cool metal overlay to protect the surface of that building. These are some interior views to show you some of those same features. Another building that I don't know the story behind, but I saw it when I visited here not too long ago at Cornell. It's the Bill and Melinda Gates Hall, and they have this perforated metal overlay over most of the glass of the building. Again, I don't know the story behind it or if it's functional or movable, but an example of a secondary sort of film or surface put over glass that still allows sunlight, but adds a cool architectural and sometimes functional feature. Okay, so that's it for the examples of all those different categories of fixes. It looks like we're going out right on 1 hour. I have about, it looks like 16 slides to go, so not too much. So I'm going to go through them and then we'll open up for questions. So I want to shift back now to just circling back to the lighting best practices. I just couldn't find a better place to fit them, so I put them here. Basically, I think simply we need to stop using so much light so irresponsibly. We need to determine what light is actually needed and then maximize useful light on like each and every project. These are some images that originally came out of the Toronto Bird Safe Buildings manual that I'm still using today because they just really show some of the key ways that we need to reduce light trespass from inside, avoid uplighting of buildings, facades, but also signs. Also on any property, this is on a private property, installing full cutoff fixtures, so don't have these big, brightly lit, glaring fixtures. Another thing to do is install motion detection. Motion detection has been proven to be safer anyway than big yard lights of sorts. When we look at municipal lighting, these kind of old-fashioned globe lights, to begin to address those, I don't even know how you begin to eliminate these existing fixtures in our municipal lighting, but let's not make any more of these. And then taking it to our homes, this is something that everyone on the call can actually do, like with one trip to Menards. This was my front porch before and after. We did a number of things before discovering that you can just simply buy a full cutoff bulb to go inside these classic what we call glass and brass fixtures that go on the front of many of our buildings. Although I am starting to see more homes also with non-light polluting fixtures, downlit, non-glaring fixtures. And also when we've done it poorly out in the community, we need to just go in and fix it. This is an example in Arizona of a ball field that was retrofitted with full cutoff fixtures, and the difference is incredible. And then one last word about lighting. A lot of places are converting to LEDs, which is a great thing. They're very programmable, which helps in lights out efforts. They're also very efficient, which helps cities with costs. But there are some, a lot of, at least the original ones that were used were very bright. They contained what we call blue, rich, white light. Which is it's detrimental to many animals, including people. And so I think more and more those are going into warmer lighting temperatures so that humans and other animals aren't so severely affected. It's kind of complicated, but the LEDs are measured in Kelvin temperature, and so to get away from that blue rich white light, generally it's called the correlated color temperature is generally recommended not to exceed 3000 Kelvin. So look into that if that is a situation you're in. Okay, so next to last, talking about existing and pending legislation. Again, this is a moving target of major proportion right now. This is not super up to date in terms of the map, because things are moving so quickly. So ignoring the details, what this map tells you is that this is a real issue that has beginning to get attention at the legislative level. Federally, there's a Bird Safe Buildings Act that has been brought up a number of times. It's currently, I think, being reviewed. And then there are a number of different state and local guidance or ordinances or guidelines or legislation or code in places all over the country and presumably all over the world. So many now recognize the need to address glass through regulations. It's really where we're headed. So just be aware of this, and it just helps to build sort of, you can take any means of legislation and use that in either a specific firm can choose to adhere to, for example, LEED, or can choose to adhere to Minnesota's standard, or can choose to adhere to the federal proposal. So it gives you a place to sort of start in your own firm or with your own projects, if you're not technically mandated to do so in your area. So here in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Sustainable Building Guidelines, the B3 or MSBG. I was involved in version 2.2, which came out in 2013. We authored that. That was the first version that included bird safety. So the Sustainable Building Guidelines talks about all aspects of sustainability, and the Bird Safe Building Guideline in the 2013 version was real specifically called the Bird Safe Building. It was called Bird Safe Building. Now they call it the Animal Habitat Support, but it has sort of the same, it applies to the same buildings, and it sort of addresses the same features. So it applies to bond-funded buildings in Minnesota, so general obligation bond-funded buildings. It targets high-risk situations, so some of the things we talked about, clear barriers and adjacencies. It requires mitigation of those high-risk surfaces. It requires lights out. It requires monitoring post-construction. And it does use the threat factor ratings, as I was talking about before. The other interesting guideline that we have at our disposal here that you could use again in that same way I was talking about, you could follow it in your own projects, is the Skyway Ordinance. And so it basically defines what bird safe glazing is, and it gives you sort of 3 paths to meeting that requirement. So it's either very specific, and number 3, it gives you 1 of 4 specific patterns. Just use these patterns if you don't want to think about it, and you will pass. You will That's how the Skyway Ordinance went down, and that was due in great part to Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis. I only served technically to help with that. They were the ones that brought that to and through council. Okay, so this is the last one, really. Yes, we're almost done. To find and utilize resources. This is something I don't even really need to tell you about in the age of the internet, but I'll tell you who my go-to sources are. For all things lighting, I recommend you follow and go to the International Dark Sky Association. They have tremendous resources on their website about the issue of light pollution and also products available. And they even have certified products that might be in your local Menards and Lowe's in terms of personal use. In terms of bird safety, I turn to ABC. They are the ones that are producing the most up-to-date and cutting edge resources on bird safety. They have a a guide, Bird Safe Buildings Guide. They have a very dynamic website. And if you're looking for just a little bit to introduce this subject to somebody, I did do a TED Talk a number of years ago that you can find easily online. It's like 12 minutes long, and it has been used a lot to like introduce this subject in that sort of TED Talk high level way. So those are some resources, and you can ask me if you have questions about others. And then lastly, to just circle back to our learning objectives, I hope we accomplished this, understanding how buildings affect birds, talking about best practices, a little bit on the legislation, and just where to utilize or where to find resources. And that, my friends, concludes the official portion of this. So I'm open to any and all questions that you might have at this point.
Thank you, Joanna. We have several questions, and then I just wanted to remind any architects to type their AIA number in the chat if they would like to receive continuing education credits. So we have a few questions. The first one was from an earlier slide showing the mortality rates during migration.
Yeah.
And the person asked, why is the spring migration collisions seem lower than in the fall?
Yes, great question. Great observation. Okay, so the reason for that is that the sheer number of birds. So basically in the spring, they're coming up here to breed. So they're coming through Minnesota, oftentimes to northern Minnesota or to Canada. I'll bring that one back up. It's way up top. And they have created many, many baby birds in the time right in here. So the sheer volume number of birds that are coming out of Canada is many times more than came in the spring. So it's just a reproduction. Part of it is a reproduction thing. So they just make baby birds, and then all of them are flying south together in the fall. So you got a lot more birds. Also, they tend to be, another theory is they tend to be much more purposeful in the spring. They're going straight north. They got to get onto territories to claim their ground and to get breeding as soon as possible. And on the fall, some people think that they tend to meander a little more. I don't know what the proof is for that, but I have heard that said. So very good question. Thank you.
And then our next question is about the stadium. And the question is, why did the Vikings and US Bank refuse to accommodate bird safety, and have they done anything to address it in the meantime?
So why did they? You know, there was different reasons they said, and the first reason that they said was aesthetics. I don't need to bring these up. The first reason that we were given was aesthetics, that they just didn't like the look of the patterns on the glass. And unfortunately, that mind's eye thing might have come into play. I really don't know all of what was involved in that, but we did talk to them many times. We showed them all the things I'm showing you. For whatever reason, they decided that it wasn't an issue that they needed to address. And the question of retrofit, so another thing coming out of that, which I didn't really spend much time on, was so at a point early on, the team that I was working with, we sort of said we needed I wouldn't even call it a plan B. It was sort of more of like a heaven forbid they don't change the glass. What are we going to do? And we decided at that point to propose a study, like a bomb-proof, peer-reviewed, best study we could imagine. If it came to that they decided not to do it for whatever their reasons were. And that came to pass. We couldn't believe we were in the situation where they didn't change the design. It was a simple change. But we did end up doing the study, and they funded the study, which is, and it was they had no say in the results. They had no say in the methodology. It was 100% independent scientific study funded by an NFL team and its owners or the operators. Anyway, that is to say that we found out a lot of information about that building, which is going to now hopefully inform retrofits. So for example, one of the first things you need to do if you have a problem building of any shape or size is you got to really figure out where your problems are, because you don't have to usually fix the whole thing. And that was what we were able to do without a question of a doubt, is pinpoint the exact locations where a retrofit of some kind would be best invested in on that building. So I don't know if that answers it, but nothing has happened so far, but there's still hope and people are still working on that.
And just along with that, as a follow-up, if people are, as citizens, are interested in commenting on that issue, who would they direct their feedback to for the urging local officials to support retro?
Yeah. Well, what I like to do is take it away from the stadium view and look at the broader view. So I always tell people the first thing you do is take care of your own home. So take care of your own home. If you care about this issue, birds are by far being killed more at our homes than at any one large building. Not to dismiss that at all, but please first fix your own home and then you can work through your own local municipalities to teach them about the issue. And speak through any of these sort of municipal avenues. And I used to believe that we could make this happen without the legislation, but more and more I'm really realizing that we need to support any legislation that's in place that's logical and that's smart and that doesn't make people do a whole bunch of work for not a lot of benefits. So I want people, architects, designers, city planners, to be incorporating really smart solutions, but not down to the letter of the law, but with the spirit of the law, we can save so many birds, like so many birds. So does that help? And then in terms of, I don't really, Minneapolis, you can go to Minneapolis in the city in general about the issue, again, for them to work on. But then any individual building you know of that is having problems, you go to the management of that building and go respectfully, go collaboratively, knowing they didn't build the building. Most buildings weren't built to kill birds. It's for the most part a side effect, although as buildings built in this era where we know what we know and where it's been pointed out, they're a different story. But voice your opinions in as respectful a way as possible is my motto.
We have two questions about how much fritted glass that's manufactured to bird safe standards would add to the cost of regular windows, or if you could just speak to the cost factor versus regular glass for anyone who's interested in investing in those.
So I used to know those figures about what the difference is, and more, so fritted glass costs more than plain glass, but I don't even like to think of it that way. I like to think of it in like a whole different paradigm, in that, like, think about the slide I showed all those examples of buildings that were built bird safe, but not with the intention of being bird safe. That tells us that we can build a bird safe building without adding any cost, if you think of it that way, right? If you consider it an add-on, then it's an upcharge. That's different. If you plan it with all of the other goals, again, integral to the design of the building, then you create, for example, I just was watching a different webinar from Studio Gang, beautiful architectural features where they've made these outdoor, outdoor walkways for people in this space between a artificial, like one of those walls in front of the building and the glass, and they've made a space for people to get outdoors. So that's taking all of the goals of your project, whether it be energy performance or bird safety or a beautiful aesthetic, and putting them all together and solving them all together. Do you know what I'm trying to say? It's like, yes, if we build this, make this entire design, spend 5 years on the concept and the plans, and then we say, oh no, swap the glass out and put this one in. Yeah, that's an upcharge, that's an add-on, that's going to be an added cost. But if we consider it as one of the goals of the project, it's just one of the costs of the project. So I don't know if that helps. But to give you an example, we calculated the full on, this was however many years ago, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, what's it been now, for the stadium, for that enormous glass building, to switch it out. I think it was $900,000 if you looked at it as an add alternate. Basically, don't use this one, use this one instead. That's what it costs on an enormous building. I don't know if that helps, gets into some concept, but it's really where we need to be thinking. We need to be thinking of it as not add alternate. If you're building an energy efficient building, you wouldn't go design the building inefficiently, and it's for this cost, $2 million. Well, no building costs $2 million anymore, but just for the sake of argument, here's my inefficient building at $2 million. Oh, to build it efficiently, I have to add all these things that make it efficient, and now it's $3 million. That's add alternate. So I encourage and plead with people to think of it as integrated with the design. It's integrated with your other goals. Okay.
Great. Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Oh yes, sure. I got 9 more minutes.
So are there any specific strategies for larger birds, specifically eagles? There's a hotel tower in the mountains of Washington State that will be located near an eagle's nest. So would the 1st through 3rd floor strategy not apply to birds that soar higher in the air?
Well, and even the 1st through 3rd floor strategy doesn't even protect all little birds, because they're using that upper airspace too. So the reason, and this is, I know this is kind of confusing, it's hard to explain, but it's really only the reason that statistically we focus on those first few floors is because, again, a lot of things come together, and there's multiple hazards come together on the 1st through, say to the height of like mature trees is really how we think of it. So it's not that that glass is inherently any more dangerous. It's just that there's a lot of birds are using that space. But I have watched birds hit, I've seen birds hit like this, from like this at the 6th level or something. So absolutely a building like that, if there's concern about birds of prey, any place that you put a glass building up into the airspace is habitat. In my opinion, you should mitigate the glass. So birds of prey, and I know eagles do hit windows. We get birds of prey in the Raptor Center quite frequently that are collision victims, so they're not immune to it. It's mostly small songbirds, but birds of prey definitely hit windows too. So hope that answers that. I would, yes, consider mitigating the glass in one of these beautiful and other ways that has other uses as well. I would think about doing that.
And this question comes from the Bakken.
Hey.
They had originally planned to use UV film before they switched to etched glass, and they learned that the testing methodology of the effectiveness of the UV film was questionable. And in some cases, the Ornolux UV film may kill more birds than conventional glass. And so they're asking for your thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, so I know that argument that Ornolux attracts birds. I'm not I don't know what to say about that. I don't know if that's true or not. So UV, okay, so first of all, good, very good decision to choose an integrated product that's then versus a film. That was so smart because these films have to be replaced. That's the reason you just really need to handle it in the design phase and not be trying to even add a film in the design phase. I didn't actually even know people did that. So the choice that you made with, I think you've got the etched product from Walker. And that again is, I think, one of the best things that you could have done. Speaking to the UV, I think the jury is still out on UV. The reason, so the testing methodology with the tunnel test is not in any way perfect. None of the testing methodologies we have are in any way perfect. And UV is just a tricky thing to test because how do you make, because there's so many environmental factors that affect how it's going to show up on any given day at any given time. And I think to my knowledge, that's why it's difficult to test. And I am heartened by the fact that it does seem to be working well where it is installed. The places where people have installed it seem to not be having a lot of problems. Now, what I hope will happen is that at those installations, we'll have some really robust monitoring. And ideally, you'd have a situation where you have a building, you have monitoring, then you change the glass out for something like Ornolux, and then you test more. You can imagine how rare that situation is going to be, but maybe that will happen someday, where some element of glass, you have some information about how many birds it killed, and then you're able to change it out. But it's hard. These testing methodologies are tricky. So I don't know that I addressed that, but I would find out more information. I know exactly the discussion that you're talking about, and I don't know exactly what to make of it, but I can't imagine it's attracting birds, but I don't know for sure. Is that a weaselly way of getting out of that?
Our next question is a technical question about glass. If some glass products, including frit and UV treatment, are not on the outside surface, how does that interfere with the reflective qualities of glass?
So how does, say it again, Marianne? I'm sorry, it's just the crux of it. If they're not on the outside surface, how does it interfere with the reflectivity?
Yes.
So, okay, so if they're, okay, so usually a glass unit has two panes of glass and an air surface in between. The air surface can even have things inside of it. But that gives you four surfaces on which to put stuff, to put designs, to put films and things like that. When we put films, we're basically limited to the outside surface or the inside surface because you can't get to the in-between surfaces. So if you put a frit on one of the interior surfaces, that sometimes, and probably most of the time, can be really effective, depending on the pattern you choose, the color, the size of the elements, and all those things. But sometimes, if that pattern is on one of the inner surfaces, and you have a super strong reflection on the outer surface, you can't see the pattern because the reflection is so strong, if you can picture that. So the reason that we want these signals, markers, visual cues on the outside is because then the reflection isn't, then they can be seen despite the reflection. I don't know if that answered that, but that's what I think you're asking.
I think you've answered it.
Okay.
And it looks like we have time for one more question, but a lot of people are sharing some resources and links. So I was quickly going to just read some of those and then maybe ask the last question.
Okay. And then also, Marian, I don't know if you guys are going to send out the document you guys have created with a lot of links in it, because that's also very good source of information.
Yes, we can do that.
Yeah.
So someone shared that Wisconsin just launched guidelines for bird safety buildings last week.
In Madison.
Yes, in Measure
Yes.
3. And they shared the link for that. Another person has raised awareness about the Feather Friendly Company in Toronto that makes films for windows and recommends that symmetry, the 2x2 symmetry pattern. And
I'm sorry, I have tons of pictures of that, and I didn't have one in there. So no, not intentional, but yes, that's a good pattern.
So those are two comments. And then the last question is asking you to speak to the urgency of bird safe building design and habitat protection / enhancement in the context of our dramatically declining insect and bird populations.
Yeah, so I speak frequently about, like, really my core love is this whole broader picture of creating bird-friendly communities, and that whole, and native plants, and if you could look out below me in my yard all around me. So yeah, so I believe that the things we do for birds, you kind of got to take whatever it is you're interested in, birds, insects. The beauty of the movement towards protecting pollinators, for example, is that it helps birds too. So everything we can do to impress upon people at any level, whether they're decision makers in our municipalities or our neighbors, on the critical need for habitat, like I said, I'd say it a lot, anywhere and everywhere possible. And I mean from the tiniest, like boulevard, to the largest property, but also to our corporate and academic properties, where we just, don't you feel like the need for like a little fairy wand that makes it all prairie instead of mowed grass? So I think the biggest thing that everybody could do on the bigger picture, bird and insect friendly communities, is by stop mowing so much. And then to this issue, as we create habitat, we have to protect birds from the windows and reduce our own and our municipalities' light pollution. So I think they all are just like so interconnected. When you attract birds in, you got to protect them from your own windows and house and city, things like that. So.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna. It was such a privilege having you share your expertise, and thank you to all of our participants. We will share a recording of this presentation on the Audubon chapter Minneapolis, and we encourage anyone who has further questions or points of engagement to reach out on our Facebook or email or any of our points of contact with our chapter. So thank you again, and that is all. Thank you.
Thank you.